has been a joy collaborating with the Before Farm to Table team for this conference, and particularly for this program on Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm Leah Markey, the Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newbury Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Indigenous Foodways, Past and Present, via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. The Newbury is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887, and recently we reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website to make a reader appointment, or you can drop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Friday afternoons to see our fall exhibitions, Renaissance Inventions, Stradamus' Nova Aperta, and Decision 1920, A Return to Normalcy. Thanks go to the Folger Institute and the Mellon Foundation for their support. The Newbury's Darcy McNichol Center has also been a partner in this program. I'm now going to turn it over to Director of the McNichol Center, Rose Myron, who will introduce our speakers and moderate the program.
Thank you, Leah. And hello, everybody. As Kathleen and Leah have said, I want to thank you all for joining us today. We're incredibly excited to have these 3 speakers with us. And we're especially excited for this program because it's taking place on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so we're really happy to have all of you here with us to celebrate this day. In addition to celebrating the cultures, histories, and traditions of Indigenous peoples, we view this day as an opportunity to discuss and to learn about the history and legacies of settler colonialism in the United States. The Newbury is committed to contributing to a better understanding of this history in order to promote equity and cross-cultural understanding. And it's really with that obligation that we'd like to begin today's program with a statement about the Newbury's history and the land on which the city of Chicago resides, which we developed in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. The Newbury Library is situated on the Aboriginal homelands of the 3 council fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations. Many other tribal nations, including the Miamia, Wea, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, the Kiwiki, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin peoples have also called this region home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. And today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States. This land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and to build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we are situated. In addition to using this day to educate ourselves and others about the history and legacies of settler colonialism, we believe it's equally important that we highlight the resilience of Indigenous peoples and celebrate the continuance of their cultures, languages, and traditions in spite of ongoing settler colonial violence and dispossession. We are thrilled to have our 3 speakers here today with us who will be discussing how Indigenous peoples have preserved traditional foodways in spite of settler colonialism, and how they continue to fight for food sovereignty and against environmental exploitation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce these 3 speakers who are all doing this important work, and I'm going to be introducing them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Dr. Eli Suzakovic III is from the Little Shell Band of Chippewa Cree. Dr. Suzakovic is an anthropologist whose work focuses on cultural research management, ethnography, religion, oral history, and ethnobiology. He is currently a research scientist in the anthropology department and the Negaunee Integrative Research Center at the Field Museum, where he is a member of the curation team for the renovation of the Native North America Hall. Along with museum work, Dr. Suzakovic is a lecturer in the Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern and a faculty affiliate in the Native American and Indigenous Research Institute. Outside of his academic professional work, he serves on the National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council, which works with the U.S. Forest Service and USDA in developing urban forestry programs, funding protocols, and policy recommendations. Dr. Elizabeth Hoover is a descendant of the Mohawk and Mi'kmaq Indigenous communities. Dr. Hoover is an associate professor in the Environmental Science and Policy Management Department at the University of California, Berkeley, whose work focuses on food and environmental justice for Native communities. Her first book, The River is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, is an ethnographic exploration of Akwesasne Mohawks' response to Superfund contamination and environmental health research. She is currently working on a second book that explores Native American community-based farming and gardening projects, the ways in which people are defining and enacting concepts like food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, the role of Native chefs in the food movement, and the fight against the fossil fuel industry to protect heritage foods. She also recently co-edited Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States with Devon Mieswa. Chef Sean Sherman is Oglala Lakota and was born in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Renowned nationally and internationally in the culinary movement involving Indigenous foods, his main focus has been on the revitalization and evolution of Indigenous food systems throughout North America. Chef Sherman has studied the foundations of these food systems extensively in order to gain an understanding of how to bring Native American cuisine back to today's world. In 2014, he opened the Sous Chef, a catering and food education business in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. He and his business partner, Dana Thompson, also designed and opened the Tatanka Truck, which features 100% pre-contact foods of the Dakota and Minnesota territories. In October 2017, Chef Sherman was able to perform the first decolonized dinner at the James Beard House in Manhattan along with his team. His first book, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, was awarded the James Beard Medal for Best American Cookbook for 2018, and he also received the 2019 Leadership Award from the James Beard Foundation. I want to turn it over now to our three speakers. We've asked them each to talk about their work for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open things up for a discussion. If you have questions as the speakers are talking, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type your questions. You can certainly do this while the presentations are going on, but we're going to be waiting until the end of the program to open things up and ask each of our speakers to address your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Suzakovic, who's going to start off our conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Rose. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. So just to get you started. So this first picture here is kind of where my story begins with working with seed rematriation, but also more importantly, food sovereignty, and thinking about it in an urban context. So for about 10 years, I worked at the American Indian Center in Chicago as the urban ecology coordinator. And what you're seeing in front of you is a community garden, 3,000 square feet of sort of restored prairie along what used to be a riverbank, which is now a street. But what you're looking at too is plants that were planted specifically for medicinal purposes and edible purposes. And how this began was originally the education department had a Three Sisters garden, and it was doing pretty well. However, what we found living in a city and when your garden is right next to a sidewalk, people tend to walk off with your produce. So, the youth would work really hard. They would, we'd have Miami white corn, Hidatsa melons, Seneca red runner beans. And when just before they were ready to be picked, they would disappear. So one of the ideas that we came up with is, what are the plants that we can plant in a garden that people will not take, but are traditional foods? And something which was really amazing is we had sunchokes growing in the garden. Throughout Chicago, sunchokes grow all over the place. We also have lots of amaranth, pigweed, various other edible plants that are just sort of naturally growing in Chicago. So we actually cultivated them. And the advantage is nobody knew they were food except for us. But it also introduced a lot of our youth to the concept that not all foods are cultivated, but that a lot of the foods are also wild. And something going back in time, that's what my mom had taught my sister, brother, and I, is what plants you can eat. And when she would visit family out in Montana, there was a common practice of just pulling over to the side of the road and pulling up, various tubers, prairie turnips, balsam root, things like that. What she would call wild greens, which could be anything. So we grew up with that, and living in Chicago too, we did a lot of what do you call foraging, but we never thought of it like that. So picking mulberries, Juneberries, whatever we could find, it sort of supplemented the diet. It was fun, it was educational. And this is something that we brought to the youth programs at the center, and we're still doing it in various capacities. And this is some of the gardens that we would be preparing. And you'll just see the pictures going past and just various spoilers to look at. So I can go back a little bit before the Indian Centers when I worked as an archives manager for Native American Educational Services College. And for Chicago, that's kind of where we started things, as going through different maps. One of the most influential was the Scharf map of 1804 that had a lot of the roads, waterways, village sites mapped out. And it was one of the activities is we would go into these old village sites, see what was going on, just to investigate what had changed and what had not. And in many of the forest preserves, you would still see remnants of old farms and crops. So, for example, you would still see things like horseradish or asparagus. And one of the woods, there was still a Miami fishing weir that was still present. And so we would take the kids out and we'd take community out to these sites. And that kind of also got me interested in using maps and collections and seeing, how the landscape had changed, what plants were present 100, 200 years ago, what plants were now present. Also at NACE, we had 2 original copies of Anders' History of Chicago, which had extensive maps and descriptions of sites. So we would use that as well at the archives. Leaving the archives, we would then transfer this over to the Indian Center. That's where the start began. And when I went out to graduate school in Montana, what you're looking at right now is Balsam Root, which is just, I don't know if you live out west, it's a very typical plants in the sunflower family. The leaves are edible and the root is poisonous, but you have to dry it and then you can make it into like a flower. And living in Missoula, Mount Sentinel was in my backyard. So I would go up the mountain and see what I could find. So balsam root was always plentiful, along with choke cherries, rowan berries, and various other tubers. There was also bitter root up there, but I didn't really pick that. And it would be a way to supplement. And so I always think of like food sovereignty as, food sovereignty because you're broke in a way. You need to get some food. And so I never really thought of it as anything political or anything major. I just sort of see it as what people do to get food. And I still kind of keep that thought with me even to this day. So even whether we're fishing or gathering, collecting mushrooms, it's just what you do. So if we jump to the present where I'm at the Field Museum, right here you can see about 9 varieties of beans that had been in our collections for about 100 years. I did not actually know about this. I had until I talked with Liz, who was looking at the Oscar Wills collection. We found out that the Jones, some of the botanical materials that William Jones collected in 1905 were still at the museum. This, of course, brought us into current relationship with the Squaxin tribe. And the question is, how do you reawaken 100-year-old seeds? When we first went through, we had to kind of sort, and we also had to figure out how to get the seeds back to Tama. And I work in anthropology. Our collection, these were in the anthropology collection. So anthro collections has their own rules and policies as far as research, destructive analysis, and whatnot. And it's pretty extensive because it has to go through a deaccessioning committee, our legal team. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. However, I went over and talked with our botany collection folks and asked them what they do. They helped us figure out a way, and within about a week, This is the first batch of seeds to go back to Tama. And that's currently where we're at. And when we get to the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to give you a bit of background. So, thank you. And I guess we can go on over to the next speaker.
Hi, everybody. I am now unlocked and ready to share with you. Thank you, Eli. It's kind of fun to be presenting here in between Eli and Sean because I've worked with each of them on very different types of projects. Eli at the Field Museum and Sean with different cooking projects. But my job here today is just to talk a little bit about the contemporary Native American food sovereignty movement. I know many of you who are logged in are thinking about kind of historical documents, but thinking also about the contemporary people and movements who are going back to some of these documents, as Eli mentioned in the descriptions of the maps. So food sovereignty, the broader definition that was created by the international organization La Via Campesina is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So this is sort of a broader definition that has been adopted by many different organizations around the world. But in thinking about Indigenous people specifically and how Indigenous food sovereignty may be different than what people are thinking about more broadly in other parts of the world, if you want to add to that definition, thinking about the social, cultural, and economic relationships that underline community food sharing and that need to be nurtured, and also thinking about communities on different levels, so the relationship between human community members, but also humans and plant communities, animal communities, bird communities, fish communities that people rely on for a healthy food system, and the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based food and political systems. And so these last two slides, the photos that I showed you, are different native heirloom seeds from the Native Seed Garden at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. So this is a Mohawk red bread corn that Kenny Perkins is peeling back that will turn redder. And these are cranberry beans that Tina is holding. So a whirlwind, so I'm thinking about why are Native people really focused on food sovereignty now and reclaiming food sovereignty? Why did it happen that Native communities lost this status of food sovereignty? This is sort of the whirlwind history. Starts with scorched earth battle tactics. So anybody who's familiar with the American Revolution remembers that George Washington sent General Sullivan into Haudenosaunee communities with the mandate to lay waste to their settlement as punishment for not joining the Americans during the American Revolution. And so millions of bushels of corn were burned, acres and acres of fields of crops were destroyed as a way of politically weakening Haudenosaunee people. Prior to and after that, you have the theft of land from tribal communities. You have relocations. So probably the most well-known, the Trail of Tears, when Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole Creek people were relocated from the southeast out to Oklahoma. Thousands of people died along the way, but also the people who did survive and set up new communities there found themselves in very different landscapes than they had lived in the southeast. And so having to then readapt the knowledge that they have around food systems to this very different space. So after this kind of theft of land, treaties signed, communities put onto reservations that were much diminished compared to their traditional territories. You have the Dawes Act in 1887 that further reduced these land bases by privatizing the ownership of land that had been previously held by communities, giving parcels of land to enrolled tribal members, and then selling the extra to settlers who then continued to encroach. If you're on a smaller land base, it's harder and harder for your community to be able to feed itself as it had for eons. Kids are then forcibly sent to boarding schools, where there's been a lot of research into the records in the archives about how many kids were malnourished, were not fed well, developed, kind of this strange relationship with food because they weren't being fed enough, but also they were taught more Western styles of farming and taught that the ways that their communities had procured food were backwards and something to be forgotten. Also along those lines, the Bureau of Indian Affairs promoted Western farming methods and seeds, and especially in communities in the Southwest where people had very efficient dryland farming, using their own heritage seeds that had been well adapted to that landscape, to be then forced to adopt a Western style of farming and hybrid seeds, disrupted that system of traditional farming. And then you had native seeds that were collected by non-native collectors, seed breeders, and ag companies throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And this is how some of these seeds actually wound up in museums and other collections, as Eli described. In more contemporary times, the challenges include climate change. So when you have heirloom seeds that are adapted to a very specific kind of land and climate, and now the climate is doing crazy things, that makes it challenging to have successful crops. You have tribal communities that are trying to grow these heirloom seeds that are then concerned about cross-contamination with genetically modified seeds. If their neighbors have, for example, commodity corn that is distributed by Monsanto, now Bayer, Pioneer, some of these other companies. There's a lack of access in some communities to enough land for farming, to the kind of tools that they need, to the seed that they need. And in some places, the people I visited with were like, well, you know, there's some people who just aren't that interested in growing food anymore. And so these different organizations that I'll talk about, part of their goal was to spur that interest on again. So, you know, what are communities doing to try to fix some of this, to address some of this grim history that I just went over? They're working to revitalize traditional types of farming and gardening and growing food and providing local food for community members. So I first got into this topic of food sovereignty while I was working with a group in Akwesasne called Ganahiyo Yamgoya Dohage, or We Are Planting Good Seeds. And working with this organization, and you know, people were always wondering, how are other communities doing this kind of work? How are they getting funding? How are they getting youth involved? And so this sort of set me on this quest to figure out how are communities addressing these issues. So I went on this big epic road trip back in 2014, and I stopped into about 40 different communities. It was a 20,000-mile road trip around the country over about 4 months. And I interviewed people who were part of tribal food sovereignty projects around community farming and gardening to find out how were they defining food sovereignty? How are they addressing some of these issues? And so if you're interested to see more about these different groups, I started a blog called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds that featured each of the different community projects that I stopped into. And so here's an article that talks about how the different ways that some people defined food sovereignty, and really the focus on the restoration of health in the community, the physical, cultural, and spiritual health that people felt that they could reclaim if they reclaimed traditional food systems. There's a focus in many cases on culturally appropriate foods. So not just, you know, can we get enough food commodities out to people, but can we get people to be able to eat the kind of culturally appropriate foods that people had since time immemorial. The restoration of relationships between people and each other, between people and the land, and between people and the food. Thinking about levels of control over the food system on an individual level, you know, to what extent do people have control over what they're putting in their own mouths, on a community level and on a tribal self-sufficiency level. Thinking about economic independence and how that can be fostered through pushing for food sovereignty and keeping food dollars within the community. And education and the role that education played in trying to convince people to eat better and to buy into the local food system. And so part of this, especially because I was focused on farming and gardening projects, you know, there's a lot of native food sovereignty projects that are focused on foraging or fishing or hunting or other kinds of wild foods, but I was specifically looking at farming and gardening, that there is a push and a desire for the continuing and revitalization of traditional heirloom seeds. So the types of seeds that people's ancestors developed specifically for the landscapes that they're living in and where they're farming and growing. So there's groups like the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is an organization through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance that hosts seed exchange and different workshops. It's directed by Rowan White, who you see here behind a row of jars of seeds that she's often giving out in different places. And so it's an organization meant to educate people in tribal communities about how to grow for seed saving, how to do a seed sovereignty assessment within the community to figure out what kind of seeds are there, and then how to preserve those seeds and share them within the community. Part of this, how do you get access again to some of these heirloom seeds, has been through a process of seed rematriation, as ISKN calls it. So many of you have probably heard of repatriation, which is often used in the museum context of sending things home. So sending prisoners of war back to their home countries, sending ancestral remains, sacred objects back to the tribal nations from which they were taken. The word rematriation or seed rematriation was developed as a way of focusing on the feminine aspects of this work. So all of the women seed keepers through time immemorial who have stewarded these seeds. And the idea is a more circular process. So reconnecting Indigenous people to seeds, reconnecting those seeds to the motherland, and then in the process, reconnecting Indigenous people to land. So some of the different projects that have been going on, the Science Museum of Minnesota worked with the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network to take seeds that had been cataloged away since the 1930s, grow them out in the garden adjacent to the museum, and then get them back to the communities from which they were originally collected. And so in this way, the museum kept a few of the original seeds, but then also could reaccession some of the fresh seeds and then get those varieties back to communities in which in some cases weren't growing those seeds anymore. The Seed Savers Exchange, which Rowan White is the chair of the board for, has been working on going through its collections, looking at which seeds have Indigenous origins, and then growing those out in order to send them back to the communities they came from. As I mentioned, the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and the Native Seed Sanctuary has worked with Seed Shed and Mohawks from Akwesasne to develop this native seed sanctuary on land that was originally Mohawk land, and to use this property to grow out seeds like you see in the background here, this Mohawk red bread corn, and then those seeds have been brought back to Akwesasne for people's gardens, but then also as food. And as Eli mentioned, the Meskwaki tribe and the Field Museum. So I also serve on this advisory committee to revamp the North American Hall. And part of my interest in being on this committee was knowing, because Sean, who you'll hear from shortly, went on a visit to the Field Museum and reported back. He said, they've got seeds in the collection there. I saw a lot of cool corn. So I said, I'm going to check this out. And so, went through the archaeology collections with some of the curators there and found that there were all these seeds that had been collected from the Meskwaki tribe. And so it's been a multi-year process since then to reconnect some of those seeds back to the community they were collected from. And the University of Michigan is working on something similar with MACPRO, which is a consortium of tribes that work on NAGPRO issues in Michigan. So just to wrap up, Sean is going to address this more, thinking about you can get people interested in growing all of these things, you can get these seeds back into communities, but how then do you get people excited about eating this food? So another thing that I've been working on writing about is the role of Native chefs in the food sovereignty movement and getting these foods back into people's diets. So this is a book that we had come out recently, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, which has a lot of chapters about all of these different issues. So it features chefs and seed keepers and farmers and academics and fisher people and lawyers and everybody imaginable who's been thinking about these issues of food sovereignty. So you can read more about the work there. It's through University of Oklahoma Press. This is my email if people have any questions. I'm elizabeth.hoover@berkeley.edu. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sean.
All right. Thank you, Liz. So I'm just going to go through with my time and talk about the work that we're doing right now and talk about our perspective from an Indigenous culinary point of view and why we think that's really important and what we can do about it for the future coming up. So I've been in the restaurant industry almost my entire life. My mom moved my sister and I off of Pine Ridge Reservation when I was just before I started high school, and we moved to a very small town called Spearfish and on the western edge of South Dakota. And there I did high school and college, and I started working restaurants in the Black Hills at a very young age. So I was barely 13 when I got my first restaurant job, and worked all through high school and college. And then after college at Black Hills State University, I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, with basically, there wasn't a lot of opportunity in a small town, and I wanted to move to a larger city. So Minneapolis was a great place, and got there and just continued to work in restaurants. And I moved my way up very quickly. So I became a chef at a pretty young age in the Minneapolis area, and had pretty good reviews and a pretty good career building for a young chef. But a few years into my chef career, I kind of had this epiphany of doing what I'm doing now, because I just realized basically the absolute absence of indigenous culinary out there anywhere. And it was kind of eye-opening, because I realized that I could name hundreds of European recipes off the top of my head, and I could barely name a few Lakota recipes. So that was kind of striking to me, and I really wanted to understand. So I kind of had a clear vision of what I wanted to look for. I knew that my indigenous ancestors, my Lakota ancestors direct, had a lot of knowledge about plants and animals and how to produce foods. And I was very curious to try to figure out what happened to that knowledge. So I thought about like how far back it went. I thought about my great grandfather and his life cycle, basically, because he was born in the late 1850s in South Dakota, or before it was even South Dakota, really. But grew up seeing a lot of battles between the Lakota and the U.S. government. And over that childhood, he eventually grows up and sees the Battle of Little Bighorn when he's 18. He sees the formation of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He's around when the horror of Wounded Knee happens. He sees his kids have to go to boarding schools. He eventually even sees some of his children grow up and fight for the U.S. government. So I feel like there's so much turmoil during that time period of the late 1800s. And it's a very common story for indigenous communities all over the place. And it's just that realization that this history is not very old. And, we should have had this knowledge and this knowledge base and this education growing up. So part of this work was just identifying what is the term Indigenous education. And Indigenous education, is basically that we had thousands of generations of knowledge from our ancestors telling us how to survive sustainably in our environments, utilizing mostly plants and animals of our vicinity through a lot of tradition and through a lot of knowledge. And there was that knowledge base that I was really interested in, because my grandparents were the first generation in my family to go through boarding school systems, and during that assimilation efforts at the turn of the century, that's when we started losing a lot of our knowledge base and education, and that's when things start to get really damaging for us. So I really wanted to try to understand what we lost. I feel like that's a really important step of just trying to understand what was missing. So part of this work was identifying what is an indigenous food system. So I was looking at it through all the facets of how people were surviving. It was not just about culinary. It was about what people were growing, what kind of seeds were they saving, how were they farming, who were they influenced by, how are they managing soil, what kind of wild foods were they utilizing, and that knowledge of which parts of the plants to harvest and utilize for food, for medicine, for crafting, and looking at medicinals, looking at just basically everything, culinary and food preservation, of course, how people were surviving through long winters. And, there's so much knowledge base out there that we need to start to put together, and realizing that something so daunting was absolutely attainable. So within a few years of study, you start to see pieces, we start to find commonalities of other indigenous cultures. And even though we have an immense amount of diversity alive still today, I think it's really important to see how attainable this is and how important this is. And I feel like culinary plays such an important role, because we can have this knowledge base utilized in real time, and to create a new generation of chefs to be able to be creative with these flavors while paying homage to the knowledge of our ancestors, I think is going to be really important, which is why we set up the work that we're doing with our nonprofit called NATIVES, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous food systems. And we're based here in Minneapolis, where we're slowly putting together our first Indigenous educational kitchen called Indigenous Food Lab, where we hope to create and harbor a safe place for Indigenous knowledge and education, to push ourselves to be able to do a lot of research and development around Indigenous foods, and really try to look at a modern aspect of where Indigenous foods are and help evolve into a new generation of what Indigenous foods can be. So our goal is to set up this training and education kitchen, working directly with tribal communities around us. And we want to help everybody that wants to work with us to develop an Indigenous kitchen for their own community, where we can use our kitchen and our staff for training and development, so we can show people, how do you cook for 300 to 400 people a day utilizing only Indigenous ingredients of your regions? And I think that's going to be a really valuable piece. And we also are putting a lot of effort into Indigenous education. So we're going to be doing a lot of Indigenous culinary curriculum through video starting this winter. So we're really excited to get our educational studio up and going. So we could basically just do all sorts of video shorts on different food pieces and topics, interviewing with certain leaders around the nation, and just exploring and just putting out a ton of education to make it accessible for everybody to have. And utilizing that also as we work with our tribal communities and helping them to develop, culinary operations, because it's going to be really important to have access to at least one point of Indigenous culinary all over the place. I mean, we should have Indigenous restaurants across the nation right now, but we don't. So we're going to have to work hard together. And it's going to be deeper than that. Like, what does an Indigenous restaurant really mean? It's more than just being run by Indigenous peoples. It's also the ideology behind it of who are you supporting, what kind of growers, and where are you getting your food? So it's setting up systems of basically creating demand around these food to help, because we also want to help more food producers come out of this. So we see these restaurants being an important role of being able to help support more Indigenous food producers, whether they're growers or foragers or farmers or gatherers, and our fisher people and hunters and everything. So we just really want to create a system that will help support Indigenous foodways, and also just utilizing this new generation of chefs and restaurateurs and caterers and food producers to kind of just be role models for these next generations, to be able to utilize a lot of creativity to showcase like what we can do with Indigenous foods for the future. Because it's going to be a lot of fun to really look at our environments, to really think about all these plants and understand that our Indigenous ancestors had so much knowledge of the plants around us, of what we could do. And that should be exciting for chefs to showcase all of that diversity, because it's different. Every few hundred miles you go, you're in a whole different area, and it's just going to be really important for us as a whole to really work together. So we're just playing our role of setting up this Indigenous kitchen in a way that we see being extremely valuable and extremely impactful, and creating a really strong Indigenous team where we're hoping that we will see more of these Indigenous chefs, we will see more Indigenous food producers out of it. We're going to have to, work with people to work on business development, because it's hard to start businesses. It's hard to navigate, especially if you're coming from an impoverished area like I did growing up on Pine Ridge, where I had very little access to financial knowledge and how to navigate through credits and banks and all those kinds of systems to start small businesses. So we're really hoping that we can utilize a lot of our education for that development and for support. Just knowing how hard food businesses are, because typically restaurants are kind of the worst business to get into in a normal circumstance. And now because of COVID, like, it's just who could have foreseen that all food businesses out there would just be completely turned on its head, and people really don't know what to do. And it's going to be really important to have and to support these kitchens, these Indigenous kitchens, because they're going to be supporting Indigenous growers. They're going to be supporting Indigenous education and creating more knowledge base, so our children and our children's children will have access to that knowledge. And there's just so much that we can be doing. So I hope people, just continue to want to get out there and learn more, and to really help modernize Indigenous foodways, and to really think about who they can support to help this make these scenarios a reality.
Thank you so much, Sean and Liz and Eli. If you all are ready to turn your cameras back on, we're going to open it up for discussion now. We've had some great questions coming in on the chat. And I actually want to start by picking up on something that you mentioned in your presentation, Sean, which is the importance of traditional knowledge. This event is sort of the last event in a larger Food in the Book conference, which has very much focused on historical texts. And I think so often when we think of research, we think of archives, we think of books, texts. But I think what's really important that you highlighted was that so much knowledge about Indigenous foodways is outside of those sources, right? So much of it is with people and with the land. And so I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about the importance of, oral traditions and in revitalizing these foodways and just the importance of talking to people as opposed to sort of traditionally thinking about research in the way that we so often think about it within academia. And Sean, I know you just got done talking. So maybe Liz, if you want to start, I know you told us a little bit about your tour across the country talking to people, and then I think you'll all have great things to say about this.
Yeah, I think education currently is happening through all these different modes, but part of it has been about, going back to elders and people who have maintained these traditions and talking to them and just learning from the land and being on the land and working with these seeds and seeing what these seeds have to teach you year after year based on how happy they are in coming up or not, or sprouting or not. So that's been a big focus, recognizing that some people learn best through reading and written curricula, and other people learn better by just being out hands-on on the land and passing on some of these customs and traditions in that way.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I learned a lot from my mom, just telling stories of when she was growing up, and both in Montana and Northwest Territories, and just what people did. But also even working in cultural resource management, I worked for an environmental company that, we would work with the Department of Defense, mostly Department of Army, with tribes in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. So even spending time with a lot of the elders that came out for those, and we would be on landscapes, a lot of DoD land. There's no grazing, there's no development, so it's basically intact land. And most of the work I did was working with elders on what traditional wild foods are still there and even old crops. So, I mean, there was one what they call local training area where I was with the late Wilmer Mestet, and we were picking tinsel out, little prairie turnips, like out on this land, and just eating them and gathering them up. And so it's also spending time with folks and going out to these places that are, having that privilege to go to these places is, you learn a lot. And then just asking questions, and like I said before, when you're looking for something to nibble on or the paycheck isn't that great, you say, okay, what can I eat? What's growing out here? And ask questions.
Yeah, and I feel like I've been so lucky because I've been able to travel a lot because of this work and visit many different communities all over the place and just see in real time these different regions and, looking at these different areas through that Indigenous lens and taking the time to connect with the nature around there to, to learn the names of some of the new plants and to try to figure out what do you do with it, and learn from the people that know those plants really well. And I think there's just, there's so much knowledge out there, and, it's just going to be a lot of fun for people who are interested in this. But, we just really need to focus on how do we make this a mainstay within our Indigenous communities where our Indigenous, children can grow up with having access to this knowledge base and being able to be outdoors and connecting directly with the nature around us, and especially the plants, and figuring out all the different uses for it. So I think it's really important to connect and to talk with people, of course. And that's why with the work that we're doing with the Food Lab, it's really trying to make active education where we're actually hands-on a lot. And we're just trying to create a place where people can come work directly with us. And we can take groups out to some of our partner farms and just being outdoors and just, being active like that. I think it's going to be really important.
Great, thank you. I want to combine a couple of questions. A couple people have asked about sort of the place of food within the larger web of Native communities. What is the relationship between food and families, and food and the larger relationships and relationality within communities? How does food connect to cultural revitalization, language revitalization? And I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about those connections.
Yeah, I mean, food is at the center of everything. So people who in some communities are doing language revitalization projects recognize that part of that is food. And if you're going to be, working on food revitalization projects, part of that is relearning the language around that. So for example, when I was visiting the Muskogee Food Sovereignty Initiative in Oklahoma, Richard Grounds, who was the director of the Yuchi language school there, talked about how the garden was the perfect place to be learning language because you're doing what you're saying. It's very repetitive, and some people learn better in that kind of classroom. Mohawk farmers that I talked to were like, oh, I'm not good at sitting in front of that computer, but when I'm out in the garden working alongside an elder, I can pick up the language better in that way. There are foods that are necessary for different ceremonies. And so some communities are really focusing on making sure or bringing back the foods that they need for particular ceremonies, because you can't just go to like Costco and get 10 pounds of the specific kind of corn that people might need for their ceremonies. And working in gardens is, very much an opportunity to work with other people. It's not that often that it's just one person in there. And so it's provided this opportunity for people to either stay connected or reconnect with others.
Eli, you want to go?
Sure. So when I worked at the American Indian Center, part of the garden that we created was actually it originally began to supply medicinal plants for community members. So instead of having to go up to Minnesota or Wisconsin or any other place, we had a community nurse, Sally Wagner, who figured well, why don't we just plant it in front, and then that way people have direct access. And that's where it began. And with the food, a lot of the language sort of developed, and part of the curriculum. So the garden also taught science and math to a lot of the kids in our community. A lot of those kids they're in college and they're pursuing careers in environmental work and things like that. But it also got us thinking about, as teachers, language. And Chicago has about 150 plus different tribes, so teaching language is a bit precarious at times. So what we did is, I would, as much Cree as I know, I would share that with the kids. We had a Miami instructor who also spoke. We'd have Lakota, we'd have Menominee in different languages. And it was really just to let the kids hear us using it, to know that the language is relevant, and that if you're talking about a landscape, that the language can be used. And I think that was the big thing. And then also we had elders in the community who, I remember one day we were doing a unit outside with the kids, and an elder and her daughter were walking through the garden, and as soon as that elder stepped into the garden, she stopped speaking English, and everything was in Ojibwe for the entire duration. So, we just told the kids, we stopped what we were doing, and we just had the kids listen to her speak for about an hour about the garden and the different plants in Ojibwe, just so they would see somebody, using their language, and it got the kids excited. And they began to ask their parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents questions. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely connected. And food's everybody loves food. It's a topic that you can't go wrong with.
And I think that it's going to be really important that we just really normalize Indigenous foodways out there. So for an example, we have a project in Minneapolis where we're opening up a restaurant under our sous chef brand next year downtown. And it's going to be a really cool opportunity to place a Dakota-focused food space right on really sacred Dakota land, and to talk about a lot of these Dakota stories that are not known to the general public. And because it's right in front of the falls that used to be there downtown Minneapolis. And, they had, because of the industrialization of the Minneapolis area, those waterfalls are no longer there. They were replaced with concrete skirting and locks and dams and things like that. But it's important to remember a lot of these Dakota stories, or at least some of the stories of the land that you happen to be on. And part of the work that we did was working with the park board to put in the park all Indigenous plants back into the ground, and starting a program where we're going to be putting placards in front of those different plant places, so people could walk around park, see these little placards, and they'll have the Dakota name first, and then the English name, and then a description how Indigenous peoples were utilizing it. And that's going to be so powerful for non-Indigenous people to have a better understanding of the land and the history and the plants around them and the connectivity between peoples and our environment, but also for the Indigenous peoples, and especially for the Dakota people that are still here in Minnesota, and still call this their homeland, and always have. So I think it's really important that we do think about normalizing this and bringing this out into the general public and making this education, available to everybody. And that's why I like my shirt, Decolonize Education. I think it's really important to take those steps for the future generations again.
Thank you, all of you. This next question is a bit more of a specific question about some of the methods being used in Indigenous food revitalization. Somebody is wondering if there's any use of genetic sciences in ways in intersecting with these heritage seeds, or if there's any work being done to replicate and reproduce those seeds using genetic sciences of any kind, or what that kind of looks like.
So people in general, and this isn't to speak, there's a gajillion Native people out there that all have different opinions. But for the most part, the idea of cutting apart these seeds, which a lot of people have described as kind of these living relatives on the genetic level, is seen as a kind of sick thing to do. And again, this isn't to speak for everyone, but a lot of people who've been part of the seed sovereignty movement and the heirloom seed movement have really been concerned about the possibility of biotech companies taking native seeds and disrupting them on a cellular level, modifying them, patenting them, and that's seen as really kind of undesirable. So for the project that Eli mentioned, where there's these 100-year-old seeds that have been hanging out in the Field Museum for all this time, not in optimal seed bank conditions, what we've done is some of the students in a class that I had did a project where they interviewed different plant scientists and said, how would you wake up 100-year-old seeds? And gathered up that information. And right now we're working on a paper with Frank Kupka at the College of the Menominee Nation, bringing together the range of possibilities. And it's everything from you soak the seeds to kind of soaking them with other things, to treating them with different acids, to cutting them out of their shell, up to, and the most extreme thing you could do is taking genetic material from these seeds that won't sprout and trying to recreate seeds that way, with the knowledge that probably most people are not going to be down for that, but saying, okay, here's the full spectrum of possibilities of what you can do with seeds. I know some people have sent their seeds off for, if you plant your patch of corn and you're in an area where people are planting genetically modified corn, have sent their seed off for testing to see if any of that pollen has come into their field. So there's been kind of utilizing in that way of like, okay, how good a job have we done at either, staggering the planting times or hand pollinating the corn. But for the most part, a lot of people just aren't comfortable with violating a living being in that way.
Yeah, I think like right now I'm going through the seeds and sorting them on the potentials of what could potentially be used for rematriation, what's a maybe, and then seeds that are damaged. What we learned in the 2019 season was that some of the seeds that we had sorted out, and because this was done pretty quickly, had some insect damage to them, or they were just really dried out and they didn't work. But the community in Tama, they wanted to put them in the ground just to see if that would work. And so the first batch that were planted were just in the traditional method in the ground, and none of them came up. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because it just lets us know that, okay, that's not going to work. One of the things I had thought about and had worked on is a lot of folks prior to planting seeds will put them in their mouth, especially corn, sing for a particular time, and then put the seeds in the ground. So it got me thinking about saliva and actually putting together a synthetic saliva, which has a lot of like peroxide, electrolytes, and things that actually help the seed kind of wake up, even if it's not 100 years old. So I think there's a lot of, it's also less invasive. I mean, when you get into cutting open the seeds, that's really tricky. You have to have someone who knows what they're doing. That's not cheap. And then even if you cut the seed open, it doesn't guarantee that the genetic material is even still viable, or that all of it. So maybe some of it may be, but not all of it. And so it's really, working with 100-plus-year-old seeds is really tricky. And, you occasionally hear about like seeds in Egypt where they, resprouted wheat and everything like that, but also grasses and legumes. I mean, every plant stores differently. So like grains, for example, you can have them for 1,000 years and resprout them, no problem. But something like a bean or corn, it's a little tricky. So there's not really this. I don't want to say this work is starting, but I think it's starting to pick up, and there's a lot more interest in it. So people are now coming up with various methods just to see what works.
And I think it's really important to have a deeper understanding of indigenous agriculture in the Americas, and tracing the migration of agricultural systems, especially corn culture, when you trace it from the bottom of Mexico and watching it shoot both ways into the Americas and see how far reaching it goes, because you can see it crawling through all of Mexico, through the entire Caribbean, all the way up the eastern seaboard, all the way up the Mississippi, Missouri River valleys, and tracing the migration of some of these seeds, because, in the simplistic form, there's varietals of corns, beans, squash, sunflower, peppers, tobacco, things like that. But you can start to see, kind of a trace pattern of where these seeds were crawling, the different kinds of corns that were moving up the river valleys compared to the eastern seaboard, and just thinking about where those were coming from and thinking about what was left, because we have no idea how many seeds were destroyed from the late 1700s through the century of the 1800s. So we're super lucky that we have some of these collections, and we still have some of these seeds that are in the ground and in indigenous hands and in indigenous communities still today. I sit on the board of Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, where I've been watching that project with Rowan White and the seed rematriation going on, and also with a small indigenous nonprofit farm here in Minnesota called Dream World Health, where they also have a lot of really cool seed work happening right now and today in real time. And I think utilizing a farm, especially like Dream World Health, as a role model of what we can be doing of bringing these seeds back and keeping them, because these seeds are alive and they're directly related to us indigenous peoples as us, because each of these seeds has a story going to a direct community, coming from a direct region, and carries a lot of that history with it. So it's really important for us to keep the seeds alive that we have, and to make sure that if there are still some seeds hiding out there within communities or whoever, that we try and find their true homes, which in some of these holdings, because there's a lot of these botanical holdings and museums and history centers and science museums all over the nation. And a lot of those holdings, because people were gathering them at the turn of the century, meaning in the 1800s and early through the 1900s, that a lot of those collections just turned into archives. They just were no longer viable. We can't grow them. And I think we need to learn from that huge mistake when we could have been keeping these seeds alive and keeping those strains alive. And, it's going to be, I can't answer to genetically modifying these and going back and trying to recreate them. But, you can find some of these strains from some of these old varietals and some of these holdings, because some of the corn growers can look at these old corns that aren't going to grow anymore, but say like, oh, I've seen this piece, growing in some of these corns, and they must be directly related. I think some really smart elders who have been doing that for a long time might be a better solution of trying to grow back some of those strains possibly. But again, like I'm not the expert there, but I just think the education of it and having that deeper history of Indigenous agriculture is a really important one for us.
Great, thank you. We have time for just maybe one or two more questions. And the one that I want to ask next kind of is a nice segue from what we were just talking about with some of the, challenges of all the different kinds of ways that you could do this, and really finding methods that work for Indigenous communities and aren't going to harm these relatives. And so I wonder if you could all talk a little bit about any challenges that you faced working with institutions, whether it's museums, whether it's scientists, whether it's, non-native scientists, whether it's other kinds of institutions that you've had to work with where you have to do things in a particular way because of the importance of food within culture. And just speak a little bit about what the challenges have been and how you've addressed those.
I can speak as far as on the field side. I think with the Field Museum, as with a lot of museums and archives, there's a lot of internal protocols and structures. You have siloing between departments. And specifically with the Jones collection, that when he went out to Tama, so he didn't work for the Field Museum, he was actually contracted by George Dorsey and Boaz and Putnam. Jones wasn't really there interested. Jones, by the way, was the first Native American to get a PhD in anthropology. He was a Meskwaki anthropologist. He was actually not interested in collecting artifacts. What he was interested in was botanicals. And in fact, his primary collection was about 240 botanical specimens that all have significance to Meskwaki and Sauk people. And he actually collected them. What I'm finding is to actually show that these seeds, kind of to preserve them, so that down the line, because when he collected, he also wrote in Meskwaki. So we found a lot of his notes with seeds are not in English, but Meskwaki. So there's sort of it's almost like he's thinking about the future of what may happen, and to somehow protect these seeds. Jones, of course, dies in 1909. In 1927, the Economic Botany and Botany collection at the Field Museum was created. Millspaugh, who was the curator, what he did is he actually went into the Anthro collection, which had a whole lot of botanical specimens from various parts of the country. He put them in Economic Botany, but he erased any tribal or local connection and would simply say corn, Iowa. So we had a lot of items that were missing from the Anthro collection, which Liz and I found in the Economic Botany. And, so it's hopeful, but we're finding that as museums developed and curators changed collection practices, they would pull out of one collection, put into another, but then they would classify it in their own system. And what we're finding today, in fact, a lot of the work we're doing at the field is actually reconnecting a lot of materials that were originally in Anthro, and we're finding them in mammals, birds, geology, botany, finding out what happened to these missing items. And in some ways, though, in the botanical sense, what ended up in Economic Botany was actually stored better because they were intentionally stored as botanical specimens, not as cultural specimens. So our hope is that what we have in Economic Botany from the Jones collection is, if the ones that we have right now in Anthro don't necessarily pan out, we at least have those backups in Economic Botany. So in some ways, by Millspaugh taking some of those specimens out, has kind of helped us in a way. And but it also bridges the botany collections and anthro collections together, and that's something that this project is unique. Is rarely do you have two collections working together, and we're actually now building a relationship and thinking about what other botanical specimens exist in the anthro collections, what's their conditions, what's in there, because often the ethnographic artifacts get the attention, whereas the botanical is sort of like put on the side because the curators or the collections managers just don't know the specifics of that. So it's something we're working on, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes, but this project has kind of helped bridge. The other thing is that, the Meskwaki folks in Tama are directing this research as well. So it's not like the museum's doing it, but it's we're working in conjunction with the Meskwaki Department of Natural Resources and the Food Sovereignty Initiative, and that's something which is unique. Also, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're, as of yet, the only museum that directly gave the seeds back. We did not try to grow them at the museum, but we got the seeds, had them slated for destructive analysis. I think within a week, we literally got everything approved. And so in our case, we were unique too, that we are but we gave the seeds directly back. And that's kind of unique, and it seems to be working. And, I don't know. And Liz, if you want to add on to that.
I think just to summarize some of what Eli pointed out, some of the challenges are around siloing and just getting museums to rethink what is the function of a museum. So for so long, museums, seed banks, all of the historical societies gathered things in, hoarded things in to represent societies of people that were disappearing. So we have to hoard all the things from the vanishing people. They're not designed to let things back out. And so part of what we're working on through this project is redefining what is the function of a museum and its relationship to the communities from whence they hoarded all of these things. So the idea here is that, okay, does the museum need 100 beans, or can the museum keep 30 beans and, do something with the others and then reaccession, if any of them grow, and then you have a much more interesting story for your collection. And part of the revamping of Hall 8 is centered around now food sovereignty in the Meskwaki community. And the idea for that portion of the exhibit came out of this plan and desire to rematriate those seeds. And so that, I think, going forward, and I'm interested into approaching other museums and institutions and trying to use the field as an example of, hey, if these guys did it and lived to tell the story, I think your institution can too. So we shall see. But yeah, people in different spaces, I've heard horror stories from other museums. People get very proprietary about things, whether that's ancestors, whether that's anything that should be going back to the communities. And people get very like, no, I need to work on these collections and I have to hoard them all. So it's a gradual outweighting the hoarders and bringing in a new generation of people who can think about museums in a different way.
And then I guess just to address challenges, I think, speaking for myself personally, I think a lot of the challenges, of course, have been land access is probably a really big one when it comes to working with these foods. Education access, just having no centralized place to find Indigenous education, which is kind of why we're doing what we're doing and try to create a center point for having access to Indigenous education. I think, just growing up on a reservation, which has basically just been modern day segregation that's still alive, is a huge factor. And having access to education around financing and navigating some of these economic systems to get through when you come from a society and a system that keeps you away from having any access to funds. Because I think Pine Ridge has never seen under 70% unemployment. So it's kind of rough. And I just feel like if you're coming directly from a tribal community, you're also dealing with an immense amount of ancestral trauma that hasn't been dealt with either, which is a huge factor and a huge challenge too. So I think by normalizing Indigenous foodways, normalizing Indigenous education, and talking about true histories and really bringing to light a lot of Indigenous topics and issues that are out there in today's world is a huge step forward for us to be able to get past a lot of this trauma that we grow up with coming from tribal communities, whether we realize we went through it or not. Especially because our, like for me, like my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation going through boarding schools and having all sorts of, physical and mental just abuse in general, sexual abuse, and having a lot of that traumatic follow through with our families and through our communities, where we still see a lot of abuse happening because of this direct relationship and this direct history of the trauma that was given to us and those Indigenous peoples. So I think there's there's deep layers of challenges out there that goes beyond Western education versus Indigenous education. And I think we have a lot of work to do, but again, like normalizing this knowledge and these topics is a huge step forward.
Thank you. That was well put. So unfortunately, we're about out of time today. I'm so sorry we could not get to everybody's questions. I know that everybody was really eager to engage with these speakers. We had a couple of questions about specific ingredients and lists of traditional foods, and I just want to encourage everybody to check out the work of each of these speakers. Sean's cookbook is a wonderful resource. Liz mentioned her book on Indigenous food sovereignty, and Eli, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can learn more about the Seed Rematriation project on the Field's website that you and Liz are both working on. Like I said, each of these speakers have a web presence. You can go and check out their work. We'd very much encourage you to do that, and really encourage you to support them by buying their books and spending the time to learn more about these different kinds of projects that are happening across the United States.
And some people asked about where they can go to buy some of these foods. For people who are on Facebook, the I Collective, it's just I Collective, just the letter I, recently posted a whole list of different native food producers and links to their pages. And so people can go there and buy all kinds of shelf-stable goods to be mailed to them.
Awesome, thank you. And I think I'm just going to pass it on to Leah now, who's going to close us out and tell us about the next upcoming Newbury program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eli, Liz, Sean, and Rose, for this important conversation. I think we can put together a bibliography and a list of websites and post it on the calendar page for this program so that people can have more information. And special thanks also go to the Folger Institute and the Mellon Foundation. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And recording of this program will be available on the Newbury's YouTube channel in the next days. Newbury programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please make a gift to the Newbury today by visiting newbury.org/give. Please join us for our next virtual program tomorrow, Tuesday, October 13th at 5 p.m. for Presidential Scandal and the Media from Nixon to Trump, a conversation with Jill Wine-Banks and Peter Slevin. You can register for this and other programs on our website, newbury.org. Thank you.